You could blame the wine, except there wasn't any. Not for Siren, at least, who had been on her feet since the fifth bell and hadn't so much as smelled the good cask. You could blame the heat of the great hall, or the crush of bodies, or the particular way an Omega's patience wears down to the wick after the fourth insult before noon. But if a person were being scrupulously fair about the whole disaster, the fault belonged to Prince Riven. Because if the heir of Viarn had ever once in his gilded life been told no, Seren would not have had to be the first to say it. And she certainly would not have had to say it with a full jug of blackberry wine in her hands, and the entire pack watching. It had started, as these things did, small. The hall was dressed for envoys. The Duskwater pack had sent 3 of them, grey-cloaked and watchful, to sit at the high table and be flattered. And Prince Riven had spent the evening being exactly the sort of host that made a guest count the exits. He was beautiful in the careless way of men who have never had to earn a single thing they own, and he wore it like a man wears a coat he expects someone else to carry. Seren had refilled his cup all evening. On the 4th, he did not thank her, which she had not expected, and did not look at her, which she preferred. On the 5th, he decided to be entertaining. You there. He caught her wrist without looking, the way one catches a door. The Duskwater delegation thinks our Omegas are timid. Kneel and beg my pardon for the spill. There had been no spill. Seren looked down at the table, dry as a bone, then at the prince, then at the delegation, who had gone very interested in their plates. She understood the game at once. He wanted a small, frightened thing to make himself look large in front of strangers, and she was the nearest small thing to hand. "There's no spill, Your Highness," she said, keeping her voice flat and low, the voice you used on a spooked horse. "There will be," and he tipped his cup, slow and deliberate, and let a long red ribbon of wine run down the white cloth and drip into her apron. The hall tittered. Now, kneel. Later, Seren would try to find the exact moment her good sense left her, and she would never quite locate it. It was not the wine. It was the boy, little Pell, the kitchen runner, 8 years old and already flinching, whom the prince had cuffed across the ear that morning for being slow with the coals, and who was standing now at the edge of the hall with his hand still pressed to the side of his head. Something about the 2 of them, the ruined cloth and the ringing ear, lined up in her chest and struck a flint. She set the jug down. She did not kneel. "No," she said. It was not loud. That was the trouble. A shout they could have forgiven. A shout is only feeling. But she said it the way you'd state the weather, and it carried to the rafters, and the laughter in the hall died the way a candle dies when a door opens somewhere far off. Prince Riven turned fully to look at her for the first time all night. "What did you say?" "I said no." Her heart was slamming, but her hands, she noted distantly, were perfectly still. "You want the delegation to think you're strong. So you frighten the smallest people in the room, because they're the only ones who can't strike back. A boy of 8, a maid with a jug. That isn't strength, Your Highness. My grandmother had a word for a wolf who only bares his teeth at things that can't bite. She didn't call him an alpha." Somewhere in the hall, someone inhaled and forgot to let it out. The prince's face went through several weathers at once. "You forget yourself." "No," said Seren, and found to her horror that she could not stop. "I think I remember myself for the first time in about 6 years." It was, she knew even as she said it, the kind of sentence a person did not walk back from. A prince could overlook a great many things, but never being made small in front of guests. She saw him gather himself, saw the cruelty settle behind his eyes into something colder and more decided, and she braced for it, for the guards, for the cells, for whatever it was they did to Omegas who forgot their place in front of the whole pack. What she had not braced for was the voice from the doorway. "Well," it said, "go on, finish the thought." The hall moved as one. At the far end, framed in the tall arch that led to the inner keep, stood King Osric of Varn. No one had heard him come in. That was the thing about the old king. For a man broad enough to fill a doorway, he moved through his own fortress like weather, and you only knew he'd arrived when the temperature of the room changed. He was not smiling. He was not doing anything at all, which was somehow worse. His pale eyes moved from his son, to the ruined cloth, to the boy with his hand on his ear, to the Omega maid standing straight-backed at the high table with wine dripping off her apron, and he took his time about it, and no one dared breathe while he did. "Father," Riven began. "I heard it," the king said mildly, and crossed the hall. He stopped in front of Saren. Up close, he smelled of cold iron and pine, and the pull of him, the sheer settled weight of a true alpha, made her wolf lie flat inside her skin. She was suddenly ferociously aware that she had just insulted the prince of the realm, and was about to do it in front of his father, the king. "Your name," Osric said. "Saren, your grace?" Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to. "Saren," he tasted it. Then he turned, slowly, to take in the whole silent hall. The envoys, the nobles, the servants frozen along the walls, his son gone white, with fury, by the high seat. And he smiled, at last, and it was not a comforting smile. "My son believes the pack should see what an alpha is made of," said the king. "For once we agree, so the pack will see it." He lifted his voice, and it filled Grimhold to the stones. "Hear the will of your king. From this night, for one full turn of the moon, the Prince of Varn will serve this Omega as her attendant. She will speak, and he will obey. He will fetch, and carry, and wait upon her as she has waited upon him. And when the moon comes round again, this pack will judge for itself whether my son has learned the one thing his tutors never taught him." For a long moment, no one in the hall so much as swallowed. And Saren, wine still dripping quietly from the hem of her apron into the silence, thought, "Oh, what have I done?" Asterisk, asterisk. The thing about proclamations, Saren discovered, is that they do not stop being true when you wake up and wish they weren't. She surfaced from a thin, ragged sleep in the Omega dormitory beneath the west stair, in the narrow bunk that had been hers since she was a girl, and for one merciful heartbeat, she remembered nothing. Then it came back all at once, the whole ruinous evening, the wine, the boy, her own flat, unforgivable "no," the king's voice filling the hall, and she pulled the thin blanket over her face as if that had ever helped anyone. "She's alive," said a voice she knew. "I told you. You can't kill Saren by embarrassment. People have tried." Saren lowered the blanket. Tamsin sat on the end of the bunk, with her arms folded, and an expression caught precisely between delight and terror. Behind her, 3 more of the House Omegas were pretending very hard not to be listening, and failing at it. "Go away," Saren croaked. "Absolutely not." Tamsin's eyes were shining. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you? Half the keep is calling you the maid who tamed the prince. The other half thinks you'll be dead by the new moon. I've got 2 coppers riding on you. So kindly, don't make a liar of me. I didn't tame anyone." Saren sat up, scrubbing her face with both hands. "I called the heir of Varn a coward in front of a foreign delegation, and the king, Tamsin, decided to make an example of the whole thing." She stopped. "Why would he do that? Why me? He could have had me flogged and no one in the realm would have blinked. Instead, she couldn't finish it. The command was too large to say out loud in the gray light of morning. "The prince will serve this Omega." It sounded, in the retelling, like the beginning of a joke, and she had a cold, certain feeling. She was the part everyone laughed at. "Because it's brilliant is why," said Tamsin. "He's furious with the prince. Everyone knows it. The prince gambles and preens and sneers at the old alphas who actually hold this pack together. The king's been looking for a leash for months. You handed him one." She grinned. "You should be proud. Your leash. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be." Tamsin sobered. And that was worse than the teasing. She lowered her voice until it barely cleared the space between them. You know what they whisper below stairs? That the king hasn't been well, that the prince keeps company he shouldn't, and takes coin from purses that aren't his to empty, half of it's rot and gossip. But rot and gossip are what people reach for when the true thing is too frightening to say out loud. And lately there's been a great deal of both. She took a breath. Saren, listen to me. The prince is going to hate you. Not idly, properly. You made him small in front of the whole hall, and now he has to fetch your washing water for a month while the pack watches to see if he cracks. There are men in this keep who will love you for it, and men who will want you gone for it, because a prince humbled is a prince who might be replaced, and the ones who've been circling him like crows will not thank the Omega who put the idea in the king's head. She took Saren's hand. Her fingers were cold. You didn't just embarrass a boy last night. You moved a stone that a lot of larger stones were resting on. Do you understand me? Saren did not. Entirely. But some animal part of her, the part that had kept her alive in a keep full of people, ranked above her, understood the shape of it, and the shape was a warning. The door at the top of the west stair banged open. Every head in the dormitory turned, boots on the steps, unhurried, heavy, the wrong weight for a servant. A silhouette filled the low doorway, and then Odile came down into the lamplight, and Saren let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Odile ran the household of Grimhold and had done for 30 years, which meant that in every way that mattered, below the level of kings, she ran Grimhold itself. She was tall and iron-haired, and she had a face like a shut door. And she had also, when Saren was 9 and newly orphaned and small enough to hide in a linen press, found her there and not dragged her out by the ear, but climbed in beside her and sat in the dark until the crying stopped. Saren would have walked into the sea for her. Out, Odile said to the room, not unkindly, and the room went out. Tamsin squeezed Saren's hand once and followed. Then it was just the two of them, and the matron looked down at Saren for a long moment with something unreadable moving behind her eyes. You foolish, brave girl, she said softly. I have spent 9 years teaching you to keep your head down. I know. And in one night you stand on a chair over the whole pack and set it alight. Odile sat on the edge of the bunk, and to Saren's astonishment, she reached out and smoothed the hair back from her forehead the way she had when Saren was small. Well, it's done. And now you belong to a game much bigger than a spilled cup, whether you chose it or not, and I will not have you walk into it blind. Her hand stilled. There are things about this keep you don't know, child. Things I've kept from you, to keep you safe. I think the time for that is ending. Saren's skin prickled. What things? But Odile only looked at her, mouth pressed thin, as if weighing how much a heart could carry at one time. And before she could decide, boots sounded again on the stair. Quick, this time, official, and a page burst into the dormitory with his cap in his hands and his eyes wide as coins. Saren, he gasped, you're wanted, the king. In the solar. Now. Asterisk, asterisk. The solar sat at the top of the old tower, and Saren climbed to it, with her heart going like a snared bird, rehearsing apologies she knew she would not be permitted to give. She had decided, somewhere around the third landing, that the command had been a jest after all, a public humiliation for the prince. Yes, but the sort of thing a king says in a hot hall and quietly forgets by morning. He would tell her. So now he would strip the whole business away, restore the prince, and dispose of the Omega who had made the mess, and the only question left was how gently. She was still telling herself this when the guard opened the door, and she stepped through, and the story fell apart, because Prince Riven was already there. He stood at the window, with his back to the room, rigid as a spear, and when he turned and saw her, the look on his face could have stripped paint. So. Not forgotten then. Not a jest. Ah, said King Osric from the great chair by the fire. My 2 students sit, both of you. Neither of them sat. The king seemed to find this amusing. He was turning a small iron ring on his little finger, round, and he watched them over it with the patience of a man who has never once had to hurry. "You'll be wondering," he said to Saren, "why you're not in a cell. And you," to his son, "why you're not somewhere pleasanter. Allow me to disappoint you both. I meant every word I said in the hall, and there will be no softening of it in private. For one turn of the moon, my son answers to you, girl. That is the whole of it, and it is not a game." "Your Grace," Saren managed, "I never wanted. I know what you wanted. You wanted to defend a child, and you lost your temper doing it. That is the most useful thing anyone has done in this. Keep in a year." The king's voice was mild, but his eyes were not, and they had drifted to his son. "Riven has been raised to believe the pack exists to hold him up. I would like him to learn, before it kills him, that it's the other way about. You are going to teach him, not with lectures. Gods no, I've tried those. With water carried and boots cleaned, and the plain daily weight of a life he's never once had to lift. Do you understand me?" "He'll refuse," Saren said before she could stop herself. "He won't." The king smiled, thin and cold. "Because if he refuses, he forfeits his place as heir, and he knows I mean that too." His gaze slid to his son and stayed there a moment, and beneath the hard amusement, Saren caught something else, grief, almost. The look of a man watching a thing he loves ruin itself, and refusing to name it aloud. "I have buried a wife and 2 brothers, girl. I have very little left in this world that I did not put into that boy. You will forgive me if I would rather spend a month embarrassing him than a lifetime burying him too." Riven said nothing, but a muscle worked in his jaw, and he would not look at either of them. The king rose, and the whole room seemed to tilt toward him. "You'll have the truth of it soon enough, both of you. I don't do things without reasons, and my reasons are not always the ones on the surface." For half a heartbeat something crossed his face that Saren couldn't name, something tired and watchful and old. "There's more wrong in Varn than a rude boy. I need eyes I haven't already paid for, but that's a matter for another day. Go, begin." And he swept out through the inner door and left the 2 of them alone in the high, bright room with the whole impossible month hanging between them. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Riven crossed the floor in 3 strides and stopped close enough that she had to tip her chin to hold his glare. Up close, without the audience, he was less a prince and more a young man, badly frightened, and hiding it behind fury, but the fury was real enough for both. "Understand me," he said, low. "I don't know how you did it, what you said to him before, what game you're truly playing, but I will find out. You think you've won something. You've won a month of me watching you very, very closely. So, enjoy your water carried and your boots cleaned, mistress." He made the word a small knife. "Because, when this moon is over, I'll still be the heir of Viharn, and you'll still be a maid who has to sleep somewhere. Then you'd best fetch me some washing water," Saren said. "Hadn't you?" Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, gods knew, but a flinch away from one, a startled reassessment gone as fast as it came. He turned on his heel and stalked out. Saren stood alone in the solar, shaking, and let her breath out slowly, which was how she came to be by the window, and how she came to look down, idly, on nothing, on the little courtyard 4 floors below where the delivery carts came in, and how she came to see Odile. The matron stood half in shadow by the old grain store where no one had cause to be at this hour, and she was not alone. A man in duskwater gray, one of the envoys from the high table, the tallest of the 3, stood close, too close, and Odile was pressing something into his hands, a folded paper, dark with a seal. Saren watched the matron glance once over her shoulder, quick and guilty, before it vanished into the gray cloak. Then the woman who had raised her, who an hour ago had promised her the truth at last, looked up, straight up, as if she'd felt the weight of the gaze, and Saren stepped back from the glass so fast she struck her hip on the sill. When she made herself look again, the courtyard was empty. Asterisk, asterisk. There is no humbler sight in the world, Saren decided by the end of the first day, than a prince trying to carry water. That was the plain, astonishing truth of it. Riven Avarn, who could name every sword in the armory and ride anything with 4 legs, did not know that you carried the yoke across the shoulders, and not the crook of the arms, and so he had slopped half the west stair, and most of one boot before she took pity and showed him. He accepted the instruction the way a cat accepts a bath. "You're enjoying this," he said, dripping. "I am not permitted to enjoy anything, Your Highness. I'm a leash." She had decided to lean into it. It was that or scream. Buckets still half empty. Back to the well. She had expected to hate the month. She had expected him to make her hate it, to sulk and sabotage and complain to his father, until the whole thing collapsed and she was blamed for the wreckage. And for 2 days, that was very nearly how it went. He was proud in the particular airless way of a person who has never once been wrong out loud, and every task she set him he performed as though it were a duel he intended to win. But on the 3rd day, something shifted, and it shifted because of Pell. The boy had taken to trailing them, half in worship of Saren, half unable to believe the prince who'd cuffed his ear was now hauling coal like anyone else. And on the 3rd morning, Pell dropped a full scuttle down the kitchen steps, and coal went everywhere, and the child went white and rigid, waiting for the blow he'd been taught to expect from men like this one. Riven looked at him for a long moment. Then he crouched and began, clumsily, to pick up the coal. "Well," he said to the boy, not unkindly, "don't just stand there gawping. It won't gather itself." Pell dropped down beside him, disbelieving, and the 2 of them scooped lumps back into the scuttle in silence. And Saren stood in the doorway, with a strange tightness in her throat, and did not say a single clever thing. He caught her watching. "What?" "Nothing, Your Highness." She turned away before her face could betray her. "You missed a bit." It was that afternoon, up on the north rampart, where she'd sent him to carry the watchfire's fuel, that the first true crack opened between them, and neither of them planned it, which was rather the point. He had stacked the wood wrong, and she was restacking it, and he was watching her do it, with his arms folded, and an expression of deep grievance. And out of nowhere he said, "How long have you been here?" "At Grimhold, since I was 9. "And before that?" "Holding in the Low Country. My father kept sheep. Fever took them both one winter, him and my mother, and the pack sent the orphans where there was work." She said it plainly. It was old grief, worn smooth. "So, here." He was quiet a moment. "I don't remember being 9, he said. "I remember tutors, and a great many people telling me what I'd be, one day, and none of them asking what I was just then. You had a whole life before this one." "I've only ever had the one I was handed." "That sounds like a complaint from a man in a fur cloak," she said, unable to help it. But instead of bridling, he laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, and it changed his whole face. "Gods, you don't stop, do you?" He shook his head, still smiling. "No, you're right. It's a poor complaint. Ignore me. I'd have to be paid to ignore you. It's the one thing this arrangement doesn't allow." He laughed again, and she found the smile pulling at her own mouth before she could catch it. And for one unguarded moment, on the cold wall, they simply grinned at each other, like a pair of fools, and then both looked hurriedly away, as though they'd each been caught at something. That was the trouble with him, she thought later. She had built him very carefully in her mind as a single simple thing, a cruel boy, a coward in silk, and he kept, quietly and without permission, refusing to stay the shape she'd made. She had her own shape to keep, though, and it would not let her rest. Because underneath the long, strange days of coal and water and reluctant, almost laughter, the memory sat like a splinter. Odile in the courtyard shadow, the folded paper, the gray duskwater cloak swallowing it whole. She went to the matron that evening, meaning to ask. She got as far as the linen room, where Odile stood folding sheets by lamplight, humming the same tuneless song she'd hummed over Saren's childhood fevers, and the question died in her mouth. You've a face on you, Odile said without looking up. Out with it. The Duskwater men. Saren kept her voice light, busying her hands with the pillow slip so she'd have somewhere to put her eyes. Do we see much of them? Below stairs. I mean, deliveries, messages. The matron's hands did not pause on the linen, not even a hair. Envoys keep to the high table, child. We keep to the low one. Why? I thought I saw one of them in the yard, by the grain store. Odd place for a lord. You've been up 2 days running with barely a wink, Odile said comfortably, and running after a prince besides. A tired eye sees all sorts in a dark yard. She reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Saren's ear, the gesture so familiar it made Saren's chest ache. You always did startle. At shadows, my heart. Even small. You'd swear the linen press was full of wolves. She smiled. There were never any wolves. No, Saren said. I suppose there weren't. And she smiled, and helped fold the sheets, and hated herself for the lie of it, because the smoothness of the answer, the perfect unbroken calm of those folding hands, the gentle deflection, folded so neatly around her own childhood that she almost forgot she'd asked a question at all, had frightened her far more than a stammer ever could have. Odile had not been surprised by the question, and a woman with nothing to hide is always at least a little surprised to be asked. It was on her way back across the middle bailey, well after the last bell, that the cold feeling found her. She had walked this yard 1,000 times in the dark. She knew its sounds the way she knew her own breathing, the settle of the timbers, the far-off dogs, the guard on the east wall coughing his same wet cough. And tonight, one thing in it was wrong. A shape by the postern that the moon didn't touch. A stillness that was holding itself too carefully to be a servant, too quiet to be a guard. Someone was in the keep, who had no business being there. Asterisk, Saren did not run. Running told the watcher he'd been seen. Instead, she did what a maid does, kept her head down, adjusted the bundle in her arms, and walked her ordinary, tired walk toward the kitchens. And only when the buttress hit her did she stop and press herself flat to the cold stone and make herself think. The shape by the postern had been facing the guest wing, and the guest wing tonight held exactly one person worth the trouble of a man who moved like that, because the king kept to his tower, and the heir of Vharn had been given, as a small daily humiliation, a servant's cell off the lower gallery, so that his month of service might be complete. Riven was alone, one floor down, behind a door with a latch a child could lift. She was moving before she had finished deciding to. She went the servant's way. Of course, the narrow black passages that laced Grimhold's walls like veins, the ones the nobles never saw, and the maids used to be everywhere at once. She had learned them at 9 to hide in, and at 18 to work in, and now she took them at a dead silent run, one hand trailing the stone, counting doors by feel. She came out through the pantry hatch, into the lower gallery, just as the first of them reached his door. There were 2, gray cloaks, faces wrapped, and the long, thin knives that are made for one purpose and no other. That was the worst of it, the way they moved toward the prince's door with the unbothered patience of men who have done this before and expect to do it again, men for whom a sleeping heir was simply the night's work. Riven. She did not think about the impropriety of a maid screaming a prince's bare name down a gallery at midnight. There was no time to be improper in. The nearer man spun toward her, and she did the only thing a girl with no blade and no training can do, which is throw the heavy thing she is holding, a stoneware jug of lamp oil, as it happened, full into his face, and follow it with her whole weight before he could clear the knife. They went down together in a tangle, the jug shattered against his brow, oil went everywhere, cold and reeking. The man's knife skated away across the flags and spun into the dark. He was strong and he was fast, and he got a fist in her hair and wrenched, and white pain lanced down her neck, and she understood with a horrible cold clarity that she was smaller than him and untrained, and that this would end one way and one way only, except that the door behind her burst open, and Riven came through it, barefoot and absolutely murderous. Iron poker in his fist, and the air of Viarn, it turned out, was rather more than an idle boy in silk after all. He'd been raised on a training yard even if he'd been raised on nothing else, and it showed. The first blow took the assassin across the wrist that held Saren's hair. The second dropped him. The second man got one look at the wreck of his tidy ambush, the oil, the shouting, the prince very much awake and swinging iron, and made the sensible choice. He hauled his stunned partner up by the collar and ran, and their boots rang away down the far stair, and were gone into the belly of the keep. Silence crashed back into the gallery, so sudden and total it rang. Siren lay in a spreading pool of lamp oil, with her scalp on fire and her heart trying to climb out of her mouth. "You," Riven said. He was breathing hard, the poker still white-knuckled in his hand, staring down at her as if she were a thing that could not possibly exist. "You screamed my name and threw a jug of oil at a hired blade. It was nearest to hand." She sat up, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "I'd have thrown you if you'd been nearer. You're welcome." A sound broke out of him that was half a laugh and half something else entirely, and he crouched and gripped her shoulders as though to make sure she was whole. He hauled her to her feet. His grip was steady, hers was not, and for a moment they simply stood there, gripping each other's forearms in the reeking dark, two frightened young people who had very nearly died, and something passed between them that neither had the wit just then to name. Then she saw his face properly, and the something curdled because he was not surprised. Shaken, yes, but under the shaking he wore the particular flat look of a man confirming a thing he'd already feared, not discovering a new one. He looked like a man who had been waiting. "This isn't the first time," she said slowly. "Is it, Siren? They came for you, in your own father's keep, and you're not asking who or why, because you already—" She stopped, cold to the bone. "How long have you known someone wants you dead?" For half a heartbeat something raw and real showed through the cracks in him. Fear, yes, but under it a weariness far older than tonight. The look of a man who has been carrying a stone uphill so long he's forgotten what his hands felt like empty. Then the shutters came down, gentle and absolute. "You saved my life," he said, low. "So I'll tell you one true thing in return, and then you'll do exactly as I say." He drew a breath. "This is the third time. There was a girth cut through on my saddle in the spring, a fever in the autumn that the healers couldn't name, and I shouldn't have survived. And now this. Someone in this keep has been trying to put me in the ground for the better part of a year, patiently, cleverly, the way you drown a thing slowly so it looks like an accident. Tonight, they gave up patience. That frightens me more than the knives do, because it means something has changed. It means they think they've run out of time. Then we go to the king," Siren said. "Tonight. Now." "No," the word was iron. "If I run to my father with this, whoever's behind it simply steps back into the dark and waits. And next time I won't see it coming at all. I need them to keep believing I'm the idle fool who noticed nothing." His grip tightened on her arm, and his voice dropped until it was barely more than breath. "So you will speak of this to no one. Not the guard, not the captain, not a single soul in these walls." He held her eyes. "Especially not the matron. Asterisk. Asterisk. Especially not the matron." The words followed Siren through the days that came after, quiet and cold, like a draft under a door you can't find. She did not ask him what he meant. She was afraid, she realized, of the answer. Afraid of the way the two halves of her heart had begun to pull in opposite directions. One toward the woman who had raised her, one toward the boy she'd once been so sure she despised. Because it was, by then, no longer possible to despise him. The month kept them close. It was Bilta that had been the whole cruel cleverness of the king's command, but somewhere after the night of the oil and the knives, the closeness stopped being a sentence and started being the best part of her day. He stopped ordering and started asking. She stopped bracing and started laughing. He carried her water badly, and she mocked him for it fondly. And, on the cold nights he took to lingering in the kitchen, after his tasks were done, warming his hands at her fire, and telling her things, small things at first, then larger ones, that his father had not embraced him since his mother died, that the pack thought him a wastrel, and he had let them, because a wastrel is watched less closely than a threat, and there were things he needed to do that required not being watched. That the missing grain and the vanished spears and the coin that never reached the barracks were not carelessness at all, and he had spent 2 years quietly following the rot inward toward its root. And the closer he got, the more men seemed to want him dead. "Why not tell your father?" she asked one night, and he laughed without any humor in it. "Because I don't yet know how high it climbs. And a prince who accuses the wrong man of treason doesn't get a second guess. He gets a knife on a dark stair." He turned his cup in his hands. "My father thinks me idle. Half the court thinks me worse. And I have let them, because the moment they stop laughing at me is the moment they start watching me, and I cannot afford to be watched. Do you know what it is to make yourself smaller on purpose? To let people believe the poorest version of you, because the true one would get you killed?" "Yes," Saren said quietly. "As it happens, I do." He looked at her, then, really looked, the firelight moving in his eyes, and something in his face eased, as though he'd found a word in a language he'd thought no one else spoke. "Of course you do," he murmured. 9 years of keeping your head down were the same coin, you and I, different sides of it, but the same coin. A prince and a scullery maid, the same. She meant it to come out dry. It came out soft. "You throw jugs at assassins and I clean boots," he said. "The gods clearly enjoy a joke." He was quiet a moment, watching the flames. "You're the first person I've said any of it to. I'm not entirely sure why. Because I threw a jug at an assassin for you." "Because you looked at me on the first night," he said quietly. "And you weren't afraid of me, and you weren't trying to use me. Do you know how rare that is, where I stand? I've spent my whole life being wanted for what I'll one day hold. You wanted me to fetch you washing water." He looked up, and his eyes in the firelight had gone very dark and very serious. "It was the most honest anyone has ever been with me." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire ticked. Saren was suddenly, acutely aware of how little space there was between them, and of the fact that she did not want there to be any. "Riven," she said. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, already leaning in, "and I'll never say another word of it." She did not tell him to stop. He kissed her, and every careful, guarded, sensible thing in Saren's head went quiet all at once. His hand came up to cradle her jaw as though she were something that might break, and she fisted her hand in the front of his shirt, as though she meant to prove she wouldn't, and the fire, and the fear, and the whole impossible month folded down into the single warm fact of him. When they broke apart, they were both unsteady, and he pressed his forehead to hers, and breathed like a man who'd surfaced from deep water. "That," he said, "was a very poor idea." "The worst," she agreed, and kissed him again. She slept badly, and woke happy, and it was the happiness that undid her, because it made her careless. She went down before dawn to draw the fires humming, light as air, and took the servants' passage past the old muniment room, where the household ledgers were kept, and saw a line of lamplight under a door that should have been dark and locked. She should have walked on. A wiser, less happy girl would have. Instead, she eased the door until she could see through the crack, and her happiness died where she stood. Odile knelt at the open strongbox where the keep's accounts were sealed, and she was not stealing coin. She was replacing a ledger, sliding a fresh-bound book into the place where another had been, and feeding the old one, page by page, into the brazier at her side, and her face in the firelight was not the face Saren knew. The warmth was gone from it. What was left was patient and careful and entirely without tenderness. The face of a woman doing sums. And laid on the desk beside her, catching the light, was a small, dark vial, of the kind the apothecary kept under lock and ledger, the kind whose contents did not cure anything, the kind you measured in drops. A fever in the autumn that the healers couldn't name. The two thoughts came together in Saren's chest, like flint and steel, and struck. The woman who had raised her, who had climbed into a linen press to hold a crying child, who had smoothed her hair not 2 days past and called her my heart, was burning the evidence of one crime, and holding the means of another, and doing it with the calm of long practice. And Saren stood frozen in the dark passage, with the taste of the prince still on her mouth, and understood, at last and far too late, exactly whose eyes the king had wanted watching his house, and exactly why especially not the matron had cost the prince so much to say to a girl he knew that matron had raised. Asterisk, a secret. Saren was learning, is a stone you swallow. It does not get lighter for the carrying. It sits behind the breastbone, and it presses on everything, and it makes a liar of your face at the worst possible moments. Over the breakfast spread, across the washtubs, in the linen room where the woman you have loved your whole life hums a tuneless song and calls you my heart, and does not know that you watched her burn the truth and cradle a vial of death. For a full day Saren carried it and said nothing, because she did not know who to give it to. Go to the king. And she accused the woman who raised her on the strength of a lamplit glimpse. Go to the guard, and she did not know which of them Odile owned. Go to no one. And she let a poisoner walk the halls at her leisure. She spent the day being watched by the very person she was watching. At the noon meal, Odile pressed an extra heel of bread into her hand and told her she looked peaky. In the afternoon, the matron found her in the yard and asked, lightly, whether the prince had said anything of interest, whether he confided in her, out there on the cold walls at night, and Saren heard the question under the question, and answered it with a shrug and a lie, and watched Odile's face for a flicker and found none. That was the horror of it. There was no seam in the woman. 9 years of love, and not one visible thread of the other thing, and if Saren hadn't seen the vial with her own eyes, she'd have laughed anyone who named the matron traitor out of the room. By nightfall, she knew, there was only one person in Grimhold she trusted with it. And that frightened her more than the secret did, because a month ago she'd have named him her enemy, and now she'd have put her life in his hands without a breath of doubt, which was, she thought, either the bravest thing she'd ever done or the stupidest, and possibly both. She went to him, meaning to tell him everything. She did not manage it at first, because the moment she stepped into the low, warm room off the gallery and he turned and saw her face, he crossed to her at once. "What's happened?" he said. Not a question, already reaching for her, and the plain, immediate care of it undid the careful speech she'd built on the stairs. "I need," she started, and found she could not say "I need to tell you a terrible thing." What came out instead, cracked and honest, was, "I need you. Just for tonight. I need 1 hour where I'm not afraid." He went very still. Then he lifted his hands and framed her face the way he had by the fire, and searched it, and whatever he found there made his own expression open like a door. "Then be not afraid," he said softly. "I've got you." What passed between them after was not the frantic thing she'd half imagined in her narrow bunk on the lonely nights. It was quieter than that, and gentler. He gathered her in and held her like a man handling something he'd waited his whole life to be trusted with, and he pressed his mouth to her hair and said her name as though it were the only word he knew, and every guarded, armored, careful thing in Saren came loose at once and did not frighten her. There was no audience for it. There was no crown and no leash, and no month of penance. There was only Riven, and the low light, and the astonishing fact of being wanted, not for her use, not for her silence, not for her sword arm she didn't have, simply, helplessly, for herself. And then, with her cheek over his heart and his arms folded around her. The thing she had told herself for weeks could not be real reached up and proved her a liar. It broke over her without warning, a flood of feeling that was not her own, pouring in through the place where they touched, distinct and clear and utterly foreign. His joy, his fear, his disbelief that she was here at all, and under it vast and steady, something so tender it stopped her breath, the bond. It snapped open between them like a held rope going taut, and she felt him feel her feeling it, and they both went rigid, staring at each other in the dark. That was, he began, hoarse. I know, she whispered. Her eyes were wet, and she didn't care. I know, I felt it. He rested his brow to hers, and she felt his heart going like a hammer, and for a long while, neither of them said the word aloud, as though naming it might make it fragile. It hummed between them, warm and impossible. I spent weeks telling myself, you couldn't be real, he murmured against her hair when he could speak, that no one gets to want a thing this simply not me. His arm tightened. I keep waiting to be wrong about you. You won't be, she whispered, and meant it with her whole chest. And because she meant it, because there was a bond between them now, an actual open door between two souls, and you did not keep a thing like this from a person you'd let that far in, she told him. All of it there in the dark with her cheek on his chest, the lamplight under the muniment door, Odile at the open strongbox, the ledger she'd watched burn leaf by leaf, the little vial catching the light. He went very still beneath her as she spoke, his hand going quiet in her hair. When she finished, he pressed his mouth to her crown and said, low and even, you've done a braver thing telling me than you know. Let me carry it now. Sleep. And she did, emptied out and lighter than she'd carried herself in days, certain for the first time in her life that she was not alone with a terrible thing. She had never in her life been more wrong. She woke before dawn to an empty space beside her, still warm voices, low, through the door to the adjoining room. She rose, meaning only to go to him, and stopped with her hand on the latch, because the second voice was the king's. Found it then, Osric was saying, quiet and grim. You're certain? She's certain, Riven's voice. The ledgers, the vial, everything you suspected and none of the proof you could get. I told you she'd see what your paid men never could. A pause. Then the king. Low. And the girl trusts you now. Completely. Yes, said Riven. She trusts me. Completely. And Siren stood frozen at the door, with the warmth of him still on her skin, and felt the bottom drop out of the world. Asterisk. Asterisk. She did not remember opening the door. She was simply through it, and they both turned, and she watched the blood leave Riven's face as he understood exactly how long she'd been standing there. Siren, say it plainly. Her voice did not sound like her own. It came out flat and far away, the voice she'd used on a prince over a spilled cup a lifetime ago. For once, no cleverness, the command that shamed you in front of the whole pack. Your father didn't make it to teach you humility, did he? Mutter. The king had gone still in his chair. It was Riven who answered, and his voice was wrecked. No, he made it to put me in this house's heart, an outsider. Someone Odile hadn't raised to be blind, someone in nobody's pay, close enough to the accounts and the kitchens and the keys to see the thing his spies couldn't. The pieces were dropping into place with a horrible clean finality. The reckless maid who mouthed off at exactly the right moment. You didn't punish me. You recruited me. And I never even knew I'd enlisted. Siren. Riven took a step toward her and stopped when she flinched. Listen to me. Yes. That is how it began. My father suspected the rot ran through the household, and he could not prove it. And when you stood on that floor and defied me, he saw a chance to place eyes he hadn't already bought. That is true, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. The fault is mine, not the boys. King Osric had risen at last, and his voice was heavy. I gave the command. I saw a girl with a spine and no master, And I spent her without asking, because I had a traitor in my house I could not name and a son I was watching die by inches, and I would have spent a great deal more than one maid's dignity to stop it. He met her eyes without flinching, and there was no apology in it, only a kind of grim honesty. If you want someone to hate for how this began, hate me. I earned it. He only fell into you, along the way, which was not in my design, and has caused me no end of difficulty since. That's meant to comfort me, Zarin said. That I was your coin, and only accidentally his. Nothing about this is meant to comfort you, said the king. You're owed the truth. This is what it looks like, and you knew. She rounded back on Riven, the thing in her chest, cracking. Every honest thing you told me by that fire. Every word about being the same coin. You knew the whole time what I was to you. A useful pair of eyes that happened to sleep well. No, it came out of him raw. No, not the whole time. At the start, I didn't dare trust you at all. Don't you see it, you of all people? The one person in this keep raised at that woman's knee. For all I knew, you were hers. I watched you for a fortnight, certain you'd been sent to watch me. His jaw worked, and then I stopped being certain. And then I stopped wanting you to be anything but exactly what you are. It stopped being my father's errand weeks ago. It became the only true thing I have. Then why not tell me? The tears spilled over, and she let them. You had 100 chances. Last night you had. Her voice broke on it. You had all of me last night. Every last guarded piece of me, and you still didn't say it. And here he had no clever answer, and that was the worst of all, because Riven of Varn always had the answer before you'd finished the question, and now he only stood there and looked at her with his heart in ruins. Because I would have had to ask you to believe that the woman who climbed into a linen press to hold you, he said at last, very low, is a murderer. And I did not think you would. I did not think you could. I thought if I said Odiel's name, you'd hear a jealous prince slandering the only mother you've known, and you'd close against me, and I'd lose you and gain nothing. He shut his eyes. So, I was a coward. I let you find it yourself, because I hadn't the courage to make you choose. And I told myself that was kind. It wasn't. It was fear. Then, you should have let me choose badly, she said. That was mine to get wrong. You took it. You looked at me and decided what I could bear. And you arranged the whole world so I'd never have to be tested. And you call that love, but it's the same thing everyone in this keep has always done to me. Decided what the Omega could carry. Handed me the small, safe portion. Her voice was climbing, and she couldn't stop it. I put my body between you and a blade in that gallery, Riven. I'd have done it a dozen times. And you still didn't think me strong enough to hear one hard, true thing. That's not. He dragged a hand down his face. Gods. It wasn't your strength I doubted. It was mine. I couldn't bear to be the one who broke her from you. I am telling you I was a coward, and you keep hearing that I thought you weak, and they are not the same, Saren. They are not. It was. Gods help her. A good answer. That was the unbearable part. It was a good answer, and it was even mostly true, and it did not put a single crack back together, because underneath all of it lay the older, colder wound, the one that had been waiting her whole life for exactly this moment. You know what I told myself, she said, the first night you kissed me, that men like you don't look at maids like me and see anything but something to use. That it was the one iron law of my whole life, and I'd be a fool to think a crown would break it. And then I looked at you by that fire, and I decided I was wrong. I decided to be brave, for once, and want a thing I'd been taught I couldn't have. She wiped her face, furious at the tears, furious that they wouldn't stop. And it turns out I was right the first time. You did see me as something to use. You just also happened to like me while you did it. I don't know which is crueler, that you used me, or that the using was real and gentle, and I'd have called it love if I hadn't stood at the wrong door. It is love, he said, wretched. That's the part that isn't a lie. You should have let me stay a coward, she said. It hurt less. Siren, please. Don't. She was already backing toward the door. I have to think. I can't do it in this room, with you looking at me like that and the whole thing still ringing. She got the latch open. It was all a lie. And the worst of it is, you dressed it up so well I'd still choose it if I let myself. So I won't let myself. And she walked out into the gray dawn corridor, and the door shut behind her, and she got exactly 10 paces before a shape detached itself from the shadows at the end of the hall and said gently, in the voice that had sung over her childhood fevers, "There you are, my heart. I've been looking everywhere. You look as though the world has ended." Odile opened her arms. "Come here and tell me who hurt you. Asterisk, asterisk. It is a terrible thing to walk into the arms of the person you have just learned would kill you, and to let them close around you, and to make your body soften when every nerve is screaming." Siren did it anyway. She had learned, that dawn, exactly how good a liar a loving face could be. Now she would find out if she'd learned it well enough to answer in kind. "The prince," she said into Odile's shoulder, and let her voice shake, which was not difficult. "He used me. He and the king both. The whole month, it was never about penance. They put me here to spy on the household, and I was too stupid to see it, and now—" A sob, mostly real. "Now I don't know what's true. Oh, my girl." Odile stroked her hair slow and warm. "My clever, foolish girl, I warned you. Didn't I say this house was a game far bigger than you? Kings do not elevate scullery maids for love. They spend them." She drew back to look at Siren, and her eyes were soft and grave, and entirely without conscience. "But I love you for yourself. I always have. You're the nearest thing to a daughter these cold walls ever gave me. Whatever else you doubt, don't doubt that." And the awful thing, the thing Siren had to bury so deep it wouldn't show on her face, was that she believed it. That was the trap of Odile. The love was real. It had always been real. It simply was not the largest thing in her. "You were 9 when they brought you to me," the matron murmured, rocking her a little, the way she had a lifetime ago. A scrap of a thing that flinched at raised voices. "And do you know what I saw? Not a servant, a survivor. Someone who would do what needed doing and not weep about it after. Everyone else in this keep looked at you and saw a pair of hands. I looked at you and saw the only person here I'd ever trust at my back." Her voice dropped, warm and low and terrible. "They will always spend you, my heart, the king, the prince, the whole gilded lot of them. To them you are useful, and useful things get used up. Only I have ever wanted you for what you are. Come with me and I'll never let them take another piece of you." It was so exactly the shape of Siren's oldest fear that for one swaying moment she nearly leaned into it and let it be true, nearly let the warm lie close over her head like water, because it was so much kinder than the cold morning she'd just survived. Then she thought of a boy with his hand pressed to a ringing ear, and a prince crouching to gather spilled coal, and she came back to herself. "They'll dispose of you now, of course," Odile went on, conversational, tucking Siren's hair back. "You've served their turn. You know too much of the household's business to be left rattling about below stairs. If I were you, I'd not eat anything I hadn't drawn myself." A small pause, to let the fear land. Unless what?" Siren whispered. "Unless we reach the Duskwater envoys first." Odile's hand went still. "There is a treaty to be sealed at midday, in the Great Hall, before the whole court. King Osric is not the man this pack believes him to be. Child, I have proof of a dozen cruelties, ledgers he's had me hide for years. But no one will hear it from a matron. They'll hear it from you, his son's own intended, the brave maid the whole pack already loves. You stand up in that hall, and you tell the envoys what the crown of VH truly is. And this rotten reign ends today, and you and I walk out of it safe, into a house that will finally be run by people who deserve it." She smiled. "House Vaness, among them. They've been so good to me." There it was. the whole shape of it, laid bare in a mother's gentle voice. Not justice. A coup. Farn handed to Duskwater and their friends. The king pulled down by the testimony of the one witness. No one would think to doubt. And Odil's poison, waiting in the wings for anything the words didn't finish. And there, too, was the flaw in it, because Odile had made one mistake. She thought grief had made Saren stupid. He drugged the fever that nearly killed the prince in the autumn. Saren thought, cold and clear behind her wet eyes. The burned ledgers, the Duskwater man in the yard, 3 attempts on Riven's life, and every one of them needing a hand inside these walls. Riven had told her the truth, all of it. And the woman holding her now had told her a lie so warm and so well made that a lonelier girl would have died grateful inside it. Seren let her shoulders drop, as though something in her had given way. "Tell me what to say," she said. "I'll say it. I'll say anything. Just don't leave me alone with them." Odile's whole face lit with tenderness and triumph. "That's my girl," she breathed, and kissed her brow, and took her hand. And as they walked the long, cold corridors toward the great hall, toward the envoys and the treaty, and the king at the head of it all, Saren made herself small and frightened and biddable on the outside, and on the inside she laid her plans like a woman setting a snare. She could not simply blurt the truth. Odile had spent a lifetime being believed, and a distraught maid's word against the beloved matrons would be dismissed as grief. She would need to make Odile's own calm crack in front of witnesses. She would need to name a thing only the guilty could know she'd named. She turned the pieces over, the vial, the ledger, the yard, and fit them into an order, and prayed she'd have the nerve to speak when the whole pack's eyes came down on her. Because she knew, the way she'd known a shape by a postern didn't belong. That one wrong word in that hall would end in a war or a grave or both, and very possibly all 3, and one of the graves might be hers. The Duskwater envoys sat in their grey at the high table where the treaty lay waiting, and King Osric sat at its head looking every inch the man Saren now knew he was, tired and watchful, and playing a long patient game with his own life on the board. Riven stood at his father's shoulder. He saw Saren come in on Odile's arm, and for half a heartbeat, his whole face leapt with hope. Then he saw whose hand held hers, and the light in him guttered out, and she watched him decide. She had come to bury him. "I'm sorry," she told him with no words at all. "I should have believed you sooner. Watch, just watch, Your Grace." Odile's voice rang out across the hall, and every head turned, because a matron did not speak in open court. "Forgive an old servant her boldness, but there is a wrong in this hall that must be spoken before any treaty is sealed, and it grieves me that it should fall to me to bring it." She bowed her iron head. "It concerns the crown, and it will be better believed from a purer mouth than mine." She turned and drew Saren gently forward into the center of the floor, into the eyes of the whole pack. "Saren, tell the envoys what you know of your king." Every face in the hall swung to her, the envoys leaning in the court, breathless. Odile, sure of her, already half smiling. And Riven, who thought she'd come to end him. It would have been so easy to be what they all expected. The wronged maid, the cast-off girl, the pliant tool in a matron's steady hand. Every eye in the hall had already fit her into the smallest, safest shape, the way eyes had done her whole life. Odile was counting on it. The whole plot balanced on the certainty that Saren would do the meek, wounded thing she had always done. Saren lifted her chin and decided, as she had once before over a spilled cup, to disappoint a room full of people who thought they knew her. "I know," she said, and her voice carried clean to the rafters, "that 3 times in the past year, someone in this keep has tried to murder its heir, a cut girth, a fever that no healer could name. And 9 nights ago, 2 hired blades, in the lower gallery I know, because I put a jug of lamp oil through one man's face, to stop them." A ripple went through the hall. "I know the coin meant for the barracks has been bleeding out of Varn for years, and the grain, and the spears, and I know it did not vanish by accident. And I know exactly whose hands have been on the household's ledgers, its keys, and its kitchens, the whole while. She turned, slowly, and looked at the woman who had raised her. The same hands that raised me. Isn't that right, Mother? The hall went utterly silent. Odil's warm face did not so much as flicker, and that, more than anything, was the proof of her. The child is distraught, she said smoothly to the king, to the envoys. She's been used and cast off, and she's not herself. Grief makes people cruel. Not 1 hour passed. In the corridor outside, you put a speech in my mouth, Saren said. You told me to stand before these envoys and swear King Osric a tyrant unfit to rule. You told me to fear my own food. You told me House Vanessa would steady the realm once Osric had fallen. You gave me the words and the reasons both, and I have a very good memory, and I was never once the fool you needed me to be. She turned to the Duskwater envoys, to the tallest of them, the gray cloak from the yard. Search her rooms. Now while she stands here and cannot reach them, see whether you find an honest servant wronged, or a poisoner's ledger, and a vial of the same draught that near killed your host's own son. This is madness, Odile snapped, and her voice had changed. The warmth had drained clean out of it, and what was left was cold and quick and cornered, and every soul in the hall heard the difference. Then a search cost you nothing, said King Osric quietly, and lifted one finger, and his guards moved for the doors, and the tallest Duskwater envoy made the mistake that damned them all. He rose fast, a hand going to his belt, his eyes flicking to the doors to count them, the movement of a man whose escape had just been cut off. Every soul in that hall who had ever seen a cornered animal understood it at once. The king's guards closed on the envoy's table, and the gray cloaks froze, outnumbered. The whole 4½ of the plot laid bare by a single guilty reflex. And Odile ran. She did not run for the exit. She ran, with a speed no one expects of an old woman, straight for the king, and the knife came out of her sleeve in the same motion, thin and dark, and already wet at the tip. And Saren understood in one frozen instant that the poison had never needed the treaty at all, that the words had only ever been the pretty version. And this was the true plan, and always had been. But Saren was closer, and there was one thing in all this ruinous month she knew how to do. She did not think. She threw herself into Odile's path, caught the knife arm at the wrist the way you catch a falling jug. Not to hold it, she hadn't the strength to hold it, but to turn it, using the old woman's own furious momentum, and pivoted and put her whole weight into it. And Odile went past her and down hard onto the stone. The knife skated away across the floor. Then the guards were on her, 3 of them, pinning her thrashing to the flags. Saren stood in the center of the silent hall, breathing hard, and looked down at the woman pinned to the flagstones. You taught me to watch, she said, and her voice shook only a little. You should have remembered what I watch best. Then they hauled her up, thrashing and spitting, and dragged her out, and the warm face Saren had loved her whole life was gone entirely now, and what was left screaming down the corridor was a stranger, and it was done. Saren stood very still, and let herself understand that both of them had always been real, and that she would grieve the first one for the rest of her days. The hall erupted, the envoys demanding the search, the court on its feet, the king's voice cutting through it all, restoring order. And through the noise, Riven crossed the floor to her, and stopped an arm's length away, not daring the last step. You came to save me, he said. He looked as though he'd been struck. You walked in on her arm and I thought, Saren, I thought you'd come to watch me fall, and instead I came to stop a traitor, she said, and her voice was flat and level, and it cost her everything to keep it there. Because it was right, because she'd have handed this pack to strangers over your body. She made herself hold his eyes. Not one moment of it was forgiveness. Don't mistake the one for the other. The hope guttered in his face. Saren, you used me. It came out quiet and final. The bond doesn't unmake that. You can feel it humming between us right now, same as I can, and it still doesn't unmake it. A thing can be true and be broken at the same time. You taught me that, this morning, in that room. She stepped back. I'm glad you're alive, you'll be a good king, when it's your turn. But I don't know how to trust you, and I won't pretend I do, to make the ache stop. And she turned and walked out of the great hall, through a sea of people saying her name, and did not let a single one of them see her face crack, until the doors had shut behind her. Asterisk, asterisk, they took Odile down to the cells beneath the old fort, and the tallest Duskwater envoy with her. And in the days that followed, the whole rotten architecture of it came apart in the light. The years of skimmed coin funneled to House Vaness. The assassins bought with Farn's own stolen silver. The patient plan to hollow the pack from the inside until it fell into a neighbor's waiting hands. King Osric cut the rot out clean, and the pack, which had spent a year uneasy, without knowing why, began at last to breathe, and Seren, who had exposed it all, was offered the thing she had never once let herself want. The king made her keeper of the household in Odile's place, the youngest in Grimhold's memory, and Omega raised from the scullery to run the keep entire. She took it. She was good at it. She had always known. She would be in the small, stubborn corner of herself she'd never dared show anyone. She was less good, it turned out, at the other thing. Because Riven would not stop. The month of his service had ended the night of the trial. The command dissolved, the leash struck off, the natural order of prince and maid restored. He owed her nothing now. That was rather the point of what came next, and the whole pack understood it, which was why the whole pack could not stop talking about it. He kept fetching her water. He came to the well at dawn like any servant, Prince of Varn, and drew the household's water and carried it up the west stair. And when the guards or the nobles or the gaping kitchen boys asked him what in the gods' names he thought he was doing, he said, mildly, "Serving the keeper of this house." Is there a difficulty? There was no command compelling him. That was what silenced them. A king's word had once bent him to it. Now nothing bent him but his own will. And somehow that was harder to look at. She sent the water back. He drew it again. She told him coldly, across the war table where she now sat among the pack's advisors, that a prince, humiliating himself, did not mend a broken trust. He agreed with her entirely and kept doing it. He wrote to her, not love letters, or not only. Some were about grain requisitions, honest answers to honest questions, as though her opinion were still worth having. One said, "Only I spent your trust like a coin and told myself I was saving it. There is no cleverness left in me about you. I am simply sorry every day, in every plain word I own." He did other things too, and it was the other things that were hardest to hold out against, because a grand gesture is easy to distrust, and it was the small ones that got under her guard. He settled the back pay the barracks had been owed for 2 years, quietly, without once mentioning it to her, so that she learned of it only from a weeping stable hand. When Pell took a fever in the spring, it was the prince who sat up the night with him, and Seren found them at dawn, the heir of Varn asleep in a hard chair with a kitchen child's hand in his, and had to leave before either woke, because her eyes had gone hot, and she would not be undone by a man being decent to a servant. "He's insufferable," she told Tamsin. "He's carried your washing water up 4 flights every dawn for 6 weeks, said Tamsin, in front of the entire pack, like a man doing penance at a shrine. "Half the Omegas in this keep are in love with him now on principle. You might at least let the poor wretch speak." I let him speak. He says he's sorry. Sorry is a small word for what he did. It's a small word, Tamsin agreed. But he's said it 400 ways, and hasn't once asked you to say it back, or hurry, or forgive him faster than you're able. That's not a man managing you. I've been managed, I know the smell of it. That's a man waiting, however long it takes. You could do worse. The bond did not help. She had kept it shut since the morning it opened, clamped down hard, waiting for it to wither from neglect. It would not wither. It sat under her ribs, warm and patient and stubborn as he was, and on the long nights it hummed with the distant ache of him, and she lay in the keeper's good new bed and hated how much she missed a liar. Because that was the thing no one told you about betrayal. She was learning that it did not kill the love. It would have been simpler if it had. Instead, the love went on living inside the wound, tangled up in it so that she could not reach for one without her hand closing on the other. "You could just forgive him," Tamsin said one night, greatly daring. "That's what frightens me." "That I could." She set down her pen. "If I go back it has to be because he's made it safe to. Not because I got tired of missing him. He doesn't get me by attrition. No one does. Not ever again." It ended, as it had begun, in front of the whole pack, at the next full moon feast, a year, almost to the night, from the one where a maid had said no to a prince. He came out into the center of the hall while the court watched, and he knelt. The heir of Varn knelt on the flagstones before an Omega who had once poured his wine, and the hall went so silent Saren could hear the fires. "A year ago," Riven said, and pitched his voice to Carrie, because he wanted witnesses this time, wanted the whole pack to hold him to it. "My father commanded me to serve this woman for a month, to teach me what an alpha is made of. He was right too. I learned it, but not the lesson he meant. I learned it from her." He looked up, and his face was open, undefended, stripped of every clever thing. "So, I'll make my own command now, and no one made me, and no one can strike it off. I will serve her all my life if she'll allow it. Not as penance, as the truest thing I know how to do." He held out his hand, palm up, the way you offer a wolf a chance to bite you. "I dare you, Saren, take a fool's water for the rest of his days." The pack held its breath, and Saren looked down at the prince kneeling in the place where she'd once stood shaking with a jug in her hands, and felt the bond she'd been strangling for a year unclench, all at once, on purpose, wide open, and let him feel it, every furious, tender, helpless bit of it, watched it hit him like sun through a cracked door. "You're a terrible servant," she said. "You slop the water on the stairs, you never learn to bank a fire, and you argue with every order I give you." "All true," he said, not moving, his hands still open between them. "Give me one reason to keep you, anyway, and I can't. Reasons are what I hid behind. My father needed eyes and I needed cover, and I built a good reason for everything I did to you, and every reason was true, and not one was worth the look on your face." That morning he drew a breath, and it shook. "So I've none left. Only that I love you past all sense or use, and I'll spend my life saying it worse and worse until you believe me. That's not clever. It's just true. It's all I have that isn't." And she looked at him, the man who hid everything, hiding nothing at all, undefended before the whole pack that had watched him fetch her water for a year, and felt the last of her resistance quietly give. "That," she said unsteady, "is the first honest reason you've ever given me." "I'm a terrible servant," he said, "but I learn. See that you do." And she took his hand and pulled him up off the stones, and the whole pack, for the second time in a year, went absolutely silent. And then, unlike the first time, it roared. Asterisk, asterisk. You could argue that if Prince Riven had ever once learned to close his mouth, none of it would have happened. No spilled wine, no flat unforgivable, no king in a doorway, no month of carried water. But then again, if Saren had ever once learned to keep her head down the way Odile spent 9 years teaching her, the rot would still be eating Viharn from the inside, and the heir would be a year in his grave, and the pack would belong to strangers. So really, if a person thought about it honestly, the whole thing was his fault and her fault in exactly equal measure, which is as good a foundation for a marriage as anyone has ever found. They were bonded at the turn of the year, in the same great hall, with Pell carrying the rings, and Tamsin weeping shamelessly in the front rank, and the whole pack packed to the doors. Odile was not there. She would grow old in the cells beneath the old fort, and Saren visited her exactly once. And neither of them ever said what passed between them. Some love does not survive the truth. Some grief you simply learn to carry, like a stone, until it wears smooth. Riven cried during the vows. Saren had known he would. She didn't quite, but it was a near thing and the bond gave her away regardless. And he laughed at her through his own tears, and she stopped caring who saw. "You're stuck with me now," he murmured, when it was done. The keeper of the house and her useless water boy. "No taking it back." "Why would I take it back?" said Saren. "I'm the one who told you no first, if you recall. It's the best decision I ever made." He conceded that it was, and kissed her. And for once, she let him have the last word. They made a strange pair, to rule a pack. The boy king once thought a wastrel, and the scullery maid who'd seen the man in him before anyone bothered to look. But no one who had stood in that great hall and watched an omega turn a poisoner's own knife against the stone ever again mistook a quiet person for a small one.